Hello, and welcome to the Justice and Coffee Podcast, the podcast where we discuss a variety of justice-related issues affecting the world over a cup of coffee. This week I spoke with speaker, broadcaster, entrepreneur and founder of the charity Home for Good, Dr Krish Kandiah. We had planned to record this podcast in the studio in London over a coffee, of course, but the coronavirus put pay to that. So, earlier this week we jumped on a Skype call instead, and although the signal isn't absolutely perfect, I'm really glad we went ahead and had the conversation when we did. Krish shares with us the desperate need for more people to become foster carers and adoptive parents in this country and around the world. What's that got to do with justice, you might say? Well, give this a listen and you'll see just how closely connected those topics really are. Krish, thanks for joining us on the podcast. I know you're a very busy man, even under these current circumstances, but it's lovely to get a chance to speak to you. So tell me, how are you holding up? How is everything under coronavirus in your house?
Yeah, it's great, actually. There are lots of benefits of all being under one roof. There's 8 of us, my wife, and then 6 of our children are home, which is lovely. So we have all our meals together, we're playing a lot of board games, and our dining room table is now a table tennis court.
Oh, that's very inventive. What role is coffee playing in your life at the moment? Are you a big coffee drinker, Krish?
Yes, I think I'm an addict, actually. I'm using it to stay sane and awake, which is probably not a good idea. I'm normally a flat white person, but I have had a magic coffee when I was in Melbourne, and I don't know what they put in it, but I definitely stayed awake on the journey home.
Right, I'm writing that down. A magic coffee. I have heard Australia's the best place for coffee, or it's supposedly sort of the capital of nouveau. Yeah, coffee culture is pretty strong out there.
It is, yeah. I think followed closely by Vancouver, and then London.
And there we go. We're on the map somewhere. I think we're doing fairly well. I did wonder. I was doing my research. We don't know each other particularly well, but I was doing some research and I saw that you had fairly large family, 6 children. I'm finding it hard managing my own life, and I'm responsible for nothing other than myself. So to be the father of a household that large, I doff my cap to you, sir.
Actually, the kids are really good for us. They're normally really upbeat. Some of our kids have had pretty difficult starts in life, but still their energy and enthusiasm is a real blessing. So it kind of works both ways. There are some challenges, but there are some incredible benefits.
Yeah, I love that, and I definitely want to start talking a little bit about that for the purpose of this podcast, the subject of this podcast. And as I said, we don't know each other particularly well, but I heard you speak at the Justice Conference put on by Tear Fund, an organisation called Tear Fund, back in, I think it was February. It feels like a long time ago now, though, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Weird. It's weird. The world's weird. And I thought you're an excellent communicator, and I'm always impressed by people that can hold my attention. I'm one of the sort of people that if I go to church or if I go and hear someone talk, I do very well to take 1 or 2 things away from whatever message or sermon or speech I'm listening to. I'm terrible for stuff like that, but I was glued to my seat when I was hearing you talk, and this issue is an issue it seems like I keep coming across in life at the moment. You know, when you buy a new car and it's a red Mini and then you start seeing red Minis everywhere, it's a bit like that. It seems just to be one of those issues that keeps cropping up for me, and this is this issue of getting children out of orphanages and institutions around the world and into loving families. And I know this is a cause that you've been championing for quite some time, so I'd love Krish, just in introducing yourself a little bit about what you represent, whether you could tell us a bit about that.
Sure. No, happy to do that, Bryn. So I have 6 children. 3 of them are our birth children. 3 of them are fostered or adopted. And we discovered in the UK there's a massive need for more foster carers and adoptive parents. And so about 5.5 years ago, we started a charity called Home for Good. And it's got a simple vision, a loving home for every child in the UK care system. And that could be through amazing foster carers. It could be forever families through adoption. And it's a tough ask, actually, because many people have negative views about fostering. They think fostering is for people that need the money, and it's not about the kids. And people have negative views about adoption. Adoption is there for people who can't have their own birth children, and if you can't have your own birth children, well, there's always adoption. And in both of those instances, it's making the children a means to an end. If you're not careful, they're either a means to getting some money, or they're a means to having the family that you always wanted. And we wanted to flip that on its head and say, actually, no, the children come first. And so instead of looking for families for children, instead of looking for children for families, we're looking for families for children. We're asking for people that could step up and be the parents that children in the care system need us to be. And you might not think that's a need in your life right now, but the children need you. And so we're asking all sorts of people to step up and be the parents that these kids need. And when we got involved in that, we got drawn into another whole area of need around the world. So firstly, it was unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. We all saw the stats around the Syrian refugee crisis. And then things really changed when there was that picture of that little boy on the beach, Aylan Kurdi. And when he washed up on Bodrum Beach in Turkey, the world's attitude to unaccompanied asylum-seeking children changed. And so we got involved in a campaign to try and inspire people to kind of, it's great you want to send chocolate to Calais, or you're emptying the attic upstairs and sending wedding dresses down to the jungle, but actually a really important thing you could do is prepare to be a foster carer and receive some of these unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, because they really need loving families more than they need chocolate and teddy bears. So we got involved in that, and thousands of people came forward, and that kind of began to expand the reach of what we were doing. And then, as you say, Bryn, we got aware of this kind of need around orphanages. But I'd be interested from your perspective, Bryn, how is it popping up on your radar? Where have you been seeing this issue?
What issue? In regard to orphanage trafficking?
Yeah.
Well, it's something, actually, I first came across the issue, and when I was working for an organisation called International Justice Mission in the Dominican Republic, and whilst I was over there, I remember doing a little bit of research on Haiti and the issues that the country was experiencing, and I came across this issue that there was a case or a growth in cases of children being trafficked into orphanages for the purpose of exploitation. That orphanages were actually, in some cases, taking children, so they had the numbers that they could then reach out to the West to get, it became a lucrative business. So they would get then financial support from their donor base, and they would show the photos of these children and the improvement they'd made. But it was a farce, and it was like a reverse of exploitation, rather being a place to support and help kids grow, a place of refuge and safety. They were using it as a device to exploit the children's circumstances, and that was probably the first. This is, I don't know, 3-4 years ago. The first time I came across that, and I just thought that's one of the most horrendous things I've ever heard. And I've started to see a bit more attention turned to it, and I think there's a resistance to, because we all like things to be defined right into categories of what is good and what is bad. The grey is a really difficult place to exist, and for many people, for a long time, the idea of an orphanage is a very meritable cause. So now you're telling me it's a bad thing. Oh man, right? Where do I go? What do I need to learn? So one of the reasons I would love, it's one of the things I'd love to unpack in this conversation is just your opinion on it, having spent so much of your career and life dealing with children that need a loving parents.
Yeah, no, well put. So I definitely think there are some awful orphanages out there that are definitely set up for exploitative reasons. Some of them for the worst you can imagine. So some are being used for sexual exploitation. There's been some really terrible cases. One involving a British Airways pilot who was funding an orphanage so that he could have access to children and sexually abuse them. Other orphanages, it's an economic model that the children become a form of like zoo animal, where you can invite tourists in. They normally put these orphanages on the tourist route. And if you look on Instagram and do a search of #orphanage, what you'll mainly see is white Western backpackers and tourists playing with lots of black children. And everyone seems like they're smiling, and they give gifts to the children. but those gifts sometimes don't stay with the kids. The money is just a means to kind of keep people employed. So those are the kind of worst types. I think there are well-intentioned orphanages as well, that people genuinely think they're doing some good. And most people that support orphanages, even those backpackers, they want to do good to kids. But the fact of it is, according to surveys done by people like UNICEF and Save the Children, there's around 8 million children in the world living in orphanages.
Wow.
And on studies that are done in places like Vietnam, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, around, well, anywhere between 50 and 90% of those children have living parents. So they're not actually orphans. It's normally economics, it's normally poverty. So someone comes into your town or village and says, look, I can educate your kids, I can clothe your kids, I can feed your kids. You just need to relinquish them to the orphanage. Parents are making really impossible choices. I'm struggling to feed my kid. Here's someone that will do it for me. This might be the best thing for them. But no parent should have to make that choice. We don't have orphanages in the West. We haven't had for a very long time, because we know that children need families, they need relationships. They need that as much as they need food and clothing and education. So I'd say there are better and worse orphanages, but there's no such thing as a good orphanage. Even the most well-intentioned are not good for kids ultimately. The stats tell us that kids are more likely to suffer from mental health challenges. They're more likely to try to attempt to take their own lives. They're more likely to end up homeless, exploited, or criminalised when they leave orphanages. And that quote that there are better and worse orphanages, but there's no such thing as a good orphanage, that comes from a friend of mine called Becky Smith, who works for Save the Children, and she's their child protection lead. And there is this kind of global movement to try and change the mind of donors, of countries around orphanages. And actually the UN just last autumn passed a new declaration on the rights of the child, and it named orphanages and orphanage trafficking as a problem. And so the mindset is shifting gradually.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, we've jumped right in there, and I was going to get to that, but we're here now. One of the questions I was going to ask is, why you think it is that we have started, like you say, there's no orphanages in the West anymore, but they still exist in certain parts of the developing world. Why is that? Like, why was the likes of Barnardo's, that began as an orphanage quite a long time ago now, changed its model away from that into one that supports options such as fostering and adoption, and the promotion of those options, as opposed to being a refuge or being a physical place to house children. We did that a while back. Why is it so slow in other parts of the world? What do you think?
So I hope I'm not going to be too harsh, but I think sometimes it's due to a kind of what you might describe a colonial mindset, that there's this kind of two-tier system. There's what we consider good enough for our kids, and there's what we consider good enough for the rest of the world. And our kids deserve better, and they don't deserve better. Sometimes it's even worse. We often have a skewed view of what the rest of the world is like. There's been a book, it's a fantastic book called Factfulness, and it's written by a Swedish guy. I think he was an epidemiologist, and he's been doing surveys. He did a survey even at Davos, the Global Economic Forum, asking people what their perceptions are of places like Nigeria, Kenya, Africa. And most people assumed, even really educated people, assumed that everyone in Africa is dying of hunger, everyone in Africa is poor. And it partly, people like us that care about justice have kind of explained the worst case scenario. There are poor people in Africa, but it's not the majority. And we've kind of broadcast the worst case scenario. And so now many Westerners have this view that Africa is completely poverty stricken. They don't know about the skyscrapers in Kenya, or the burgeoning oil industry in Nigeria, or the tech explosion in lots of parts of India. They still think that many people in Africa live in mud huts and are subsistence farmers. And so they think, well, we'll never be able to do fostering and adoption there because people are too far behind. Or even worse, they say, they're too backward or stupid. So there are some kind of institutional mindset issues that need to get addressed, that we not stop thinking about the West and the rest. That's not helpful. Or we used to talk about the first world and the third world, and all of that has this kind of idea that they just couldn't cope, but it's not true.
That's interesting you say that, because the term I use is the developing world, and I was having a conversation with someone the other day about semantics, and I want to be on the right side of it. If there is a change in the way we use these terms, then I don't want to be slow to finding that out and recognizing that. So it can be a really difficult one. Let's put a quick pin on that, and I want to just rewind a little bit and go back. Because one of the things that this podcast is about is the individual. So there's a topic there, and it's a really rich topic. I want to learn about it. But I also want to know about this person I'm talking to, be it you, Krish. So where did your journey begin? Why have you come to invest so much yourself in this issue? What's your story?
Great. So I've come from a really bizarre mix of different backgrounds. My dad was born in Malaysia. His dad was born in Sri Lanka. My mum was born in India, and her dad was Irish. And, they met here in the UK, I got married, and my sister and I were born. And so I'm used to kind of lots of different cultures, lots of different things coming together. Actually, my mother was brought up for a time in her life in an orphanage, even though she had a mum and two sisters, but she was separated from them. And it was because she was mixed race. And that wasn't socially acceptable in India at that time. And so she was, a pariah. She couldn't be seen to stick the kids in an orphanage because they were not going to be socially accepted. And it was weird, actually, because, I knew that. And I know my mum hated being in the orphanage. And she loved it when she was reunited with her mum and her sisters. But I still thought orphanages were a great idea. It could be that close to you and not realise. So... it took a bit of a wake-up call for me to kind of see that. But what my mum did show when she moved to England in must have been the late 50s, early 60s, she trained as a nurse. And when she trained as a nurse, she was like the only brown person training in the hospital, and she was treated so badly. People said, what's it like using a knife and fork? But they didn't have that in the jungle. And people would throw a banana at her, and there was a lot of abuse going on, and it was normal. And my mum fought against it by welcoming people to her home. Anyone that didn't feel like they fit in, international students, they all found somewhere where they could get a welcome. They'd get rice and curry from my mum, and my mum could cook a mean curry. So I think from an early age, this idea of hospitality was embedded in my life. And then later, when I became a Christian, and hospitality is a really important part of the Christian faith, actually, that we believe that God welcomes us into his family, not into an institution, but into his family. He loves us as his own children. And that was a bit of a mindset shift for me, and led to our family becoming a fostering and adopting family.
Yeah, that's great. I like the picture you put. A pic when this conference shows that I remember it. I remember you using this picture. Was it your grandfather who was the crack shot that with the rifle?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so my grandfather was out in India working on a tea plantation, and he was the kind of brilliant marksman. So whenever there was a man-eating tiger, he was called in, and there is an amazing picture. I shared it at the conference of my grandfather standing over the body of a dead tiger. And it wasn't a trophy killing, it wasn't for sport. I oppose that, but this really was a life and death situation, and the village asked him to help him out. So, yeah, and then he signed up into the Second World War and, fought Rommel in El Alamein, and that's where he died. And it was after he died that kids were taken into an orphanage.
Wow. What a remarkable lineage. I am horribly ignorant when it comes to my own history, my own family history. And hearing this makes me think I really ought to do a bit of digging. There might be some gold in my history that I've not yet uncovered. Another thing,
there's always gold.
Oh, I'm sure there is. Once again, I must admit to being terribly self-centered and ignorant. I haven't started to really look into my past at any great depth, but maybe I should do that. One of the things I read in your book, I think it's a book called Home for Good, and you reference it quite briefly, I think, at the start, or it comes back in different chapters, which is about your time spent in Albania. I was going to ask a little bit about that.
Yeah. So after graduating from university, I did a chemistry degree, and then I got married to Miriam, who I met at uni. And then we were invited to go to Albania not long after communism had fallen. And Albania was an amazing country. I mean, we loved it so much. But it had been quite a unique place because religion had been completely banned there.
Mm.
So Enver Hoxha was the kind of communist dictator, and he made it illegal for any religious symbolism, or like you couldn't call your son John because that's a religious name from the Bible. You couldn't grow a beard because that would sign that that you're connected with Islam. And historically Albania had about 70% Islamic heritage. So he completely obliterated religion. And then after communism fell, there was a kind of resurgence. People wanted to know what they'd been missing out on. So we were invited to go and work with university students who wanted to grapple with what has Christianity got to offer our nation. So a lot of our work was with medical students who were saying, look, we've seen what a completely atheistic state does to things like morality, about how we care for vulnerable people, how you decide who and who you don't treat in hospital. And we'd like to know what Christianity has to say about that. So we were out there kind of talking about the kind of global impact of Christianity and what it does to you as an individual, but what it can offer to society.
I know to those that may or not be familiar with you before, when I was preparing for this, I heard you a couple of times on the Radio 2 breakfast show with Zoe Ball. I think, hang about, is this the guy I've got booked into a podcast? So you speak about these things very well, so well that you've obviously managed to get yourself on the radio. How did that come about, just as a very brief aside?
Well, the BBC has a mandate to be a kind of public service broadcaster, and that includes religious services. And so there are slots that happen every day. On Radio 4, it's Thought for the Day. I've done a few of them. I don't know. I don't think they think I'm good enough for Radio 4. So Radio 2 has a different kind of listenership, and they want something that's helpful, inspiring, encouraging, real. That will help people through their day. And so the Pause for Thought slot exists, and it's a real privilege. You get started off doing like 3 a.m. slots that you pre-record and only kind of deep sea fishermen and lorry drivers listen to it, or maybe foster parents who are up in the night looking after kids. And then you get moved on to the I think it's 5:45 slot with Vanessa Phelps, and she's amazing. I don't know how anyone is upbeat at that time of the morning, but you actually got to get into the studio for that one, and that was the worst slot ever because it's really hard getting into London for that time. And then after a while, hopefully if you're all right at it, you get invited onto the Zoe Ball show, and Zoe's incredible. She's a real live wire, very friendly, really engaging, and actually quite passionate about a lot of the issues we end up talking about. Talk a lot about fostering and adoption and vulnerable children, and she's been really, really supportive actually. And in lockdown it's weird because you have to do it all down the phone rather than face to face, but now it's a lot of fun, and there's an amazing team at Radio 2, just a delight to work with.
Yeah, that's great. It's funny you talk about the fact that the BBC is mandated to have this as a public service broadcaster, and what I'm finding really interesting, and there's a lot of reports that actually the uptake during the coronavirus of people that are saying, actually, there's something missing from my life, and I want to look into this. Or maybe I went to a Church of England school or something. Hey, I wonder if I looked into a local church right now or something like that. I know that you've got churches that have had dwindling congregations in their buildings. They're going online and seeing this mad uptake of people going, well, what's this all about? So there's a human thirst and appetite for these issues. I was going to ask you about maybe you could help me. What I'd love you to do is connect the dots. So some of the people are thinking, okay, there's an issue here of adoption, or the need for more adoption. There's an absence of it. There's a lack of it. There's a debt of it in this country. Okay, tell me more. What I would love for you to take us on a bit of a journey and maybe connect some of those arms between why that is such a justice issue. In regards to what the likelihood of people who have come from care ending up in the prison population or ending up in sex work, being vulnerable to exploitation. Would you share a little bit on that?
Of course. So children that have had a really rough start in life end up in the care system, and 70% of kids in care have had some form of neglect or abuse, physical violence, sexual exploitation, or sexual violence against them. So they've had a really rough start, and it's totally not their fault. They've been completely the victims in all of this. But once they come into care, and it's really unlikely they'll go back again to their birth families if something of that magnitude has happened. Often people are put in prison, so there's no way the kids can go back. They need to be loved and cared for. And foster care is designed to be a kind of temporary thing, you know, while we're figuring out what's happening to the children, while the court cases go on. You know, it's designed to end, and you normally age out of foster care at 18. And if you're lucky, you've had a stable placement with great foster carers, but many kids don't. They pinball around the system, you know, spend 6 months here, 3 months there, 8 months there, moving around, moving school to school. And that really messes up anybody, but it messes up a kid that's had a traumatic background. And so kids that age out of foster care have some pretty harsh statistics associated with them. And again, it's not their fault. It's part of the way the system's working, and they're being, you know, not treated well. So our homeless population, so care leavers make up 1% of the kind of young adults, but they're 25% of the homeless population in the UK. Wow. In the prison population, I heard the former Minister for Prisons, Rory Stewart, say it's between 40 and 50% of our prison population have had care experience. And in some areas of the UK, it's 70% of sex workers are young girls that have aged out of foster care. So, you know, homelessness, sexual exploitation, and, you know, imprisonment, those are all major justice issues. And when some people get involved in justice, it's just a kind of, I don't know, an additional lifestyle choice. Like, I love coffee. I love the coffee that you make. I think it is fantastic, and it's a great service to the world. It's brilliant. But for some people, it's the least they could do, isn't it? Buy coffee from somewhere that's traded well, and it's going to be going to go back to help people that need it, or, you know, buy a Justice T-shirt, or like something on Facebook, or share something on Twitter, or, you know, go to a conference. All those are good things, but there's another level. And, you know, when you think about it, how many hours a month do you think it's reasonable you should be doing justice? You know, is it a hobby? Is it a kind of side shuffle that we've got in our lives, that we just kind of do it as a bit? And I was convicted, partly because of my Christian faith, although I don't think this is completely restricted to Christians. You know, when I think about Jesus, he wasn't doing justice 3 hours a month on a rota, you know, helping out at a homeless shelter every 2 weeks. He lived and breathed it all the time. I mean, that was the thing that made me want to become a Christian from my kind of Hindu family background, was that Jesus, you know, wherever you looked at his life, he was living a just life, caring for vulnerable people, helping them, you know, whatever their background, whatever people thought about them. He just welcomed them, loved them all the time. And so that challenged me. And if you think about it, when is a foster carer doing justice? You know, how many hours a month is a foster carer doing justice? Well, I think it's probably at, you know, 1 o'clock in the morning, when the foster baby won't go to sleep because it's still got the drugs in his bloodstream from his mum. Or is it at, you know, 3 o'clock in the morning, where that same foster baby still isn't asleep because, you know, they're still unsettled about their new situation? Or is it at, I don't know, 7:30, when you're trying to help a child that doesn't really do food have some breakfast, because if they don't have some breakfast, they're going to run out of energy by mid-morning and they're going to get in trouble at school? Or is it at 8:30, when you're at the school gate trying to introduce a foster child to other children so that someone will play with them in the playground? Or is it at 11 a.m. where you're called into school because the foster child has not behaved well, and you're getting told off because you're a rubbish parent, and you kind of want to say, well, you know, it's not my fault, think about the history of the child, but you think, actually, I don't want to retell this child's story. The teacher should know this already. So if you think about it, foster carers, and, you know, other carers too, this isn't just about foster carers, it's just my experience. They're doing justice all the time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for as long as it takes. And I think that's the next level. And, you know, everything else that we're doing can be a great stepping stone. But I think the most rewarding life that you can live is a life that's lived for other people, and it's a life that's soaked in justice. And that's, you know, that's exciting. It's definitely challenging, but it's super exciting.
Oh, 100%. 100%. You're pumping me up with this. It's good. It's good stuff. You mentioned earlier on about the jungle, and I believe you're referring to the sort of unlicensed, somewhat of a refugee encampment in Calais that was formed a few years ago. So that was interesting to me because I went there, and part of my journey, I wouldn't say it was the start of it, but it was certainly it was a point in time that I look back to as saying, actually that led to this, led to that. It was sort of a synapse of some sort. And I was talking actually to my vicar, who was a friend of mine. I'd left a job, and I was a well-paid job in the city, and I was sort of thinking, oh, what am I doing with my life? I left the police force. I'm trying to find this issue of justice again. I got a bit lost, ended up in Mayfair, right? And he said to me, Bryn, what about your life at the moment bothers you, or what do you see in your community or in the news that bothers you? And I saw this issue in the jungle. They're just about to tear down this refugee camp in the north of France. So I went, and I went a couple of times, and just a couple of days before they tore the thing down, I still get updates, and it was a very moving experience, which led on to me exploring some other things and working for NGOs. But I looked up some of the videos I saw connected with you, and you've spent some time visiting refugee camps in Lebanon. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. So back at the time when we had this incredible response from the general public, so we put out a little Facebook post encouraging people to start the process to become foster carers, because the UK government made a promise that we would take 20,000 unaccompanied asylum-seeking children over 5 years. That was kicked off by the Aylan Kurdi picture on the beach. And we thought, wow, 20,000, that's in one sense terrible, because, Germany was taking that in a weekend, but we were going to take 5 years to do that. So in one sense, terrible. But in another sense, amazing, because before that, we'd said we weren't taking any refugees. It was in the middle of the kind of Brexit conversation. And sadly, the refugee crisis was politicised. Remember that picture of Nigel Farage standing in front of the caravan of people with his arms folded, basically telling everyone that if we didn't vote for him, then we'd be overrun by this flood of migrants. It's interesting, they used very dehumanizing language about people. It was a flood of migrants, or a swarm of migrants. So the refugee crisis has been politicized. So another level I wanted to say to the government, well done, 20,000 is pretty brave considering the kind of political climate that you're in. And we thought, but where are you going to put 20,000 unaccompanied asylum-seeking children? Our foster system is already overrun. We don't have enough places, but we know there is enough capacity in the UK. I mean, I always reference back to 1939 when the UK received 10,000 Jewish children that were fleeing the Nazis. It's something we're incredibly proud of as a nation. We've got a massive bronze statue outside Liverpool Street Stadium that recognises the kinder transport was an amazing act of generosity and hospitality. So we needed that spirit again. So we put out a little Facebook post Friday night, 9 o'clock at night, terrible time to do social media. And we had like 800 people overnight say they wanted to start the process. The next day it was 1,500. The next day it was 3,000. The next day it was 8,000. So all these people wanted to help. So we thought, okay, we need to go and do some research. Like, what kind of situations are these kids coming from? So that if they came here, we can be as prepared as possible. I had a Lebanese chef ready to do like a little video demonstration. If you became a foster carer to a child that had been in Lebanon or in Syria, what kind of food could you prepare so they'd feel at home? We were trying to think this thing through. So that's why we're in the refugee camps in Lebanon, just on the Syrian border. And it was awful. It's not a camp, it is very much like the jungle. It's just people pulling together whatever they can to kind of find some shelter and, rigging up the most basic amenities just to live. And kids were growing up there, some of them without their families. So anyway, that was the vision. And we did see thousands of people come forward. We didn't really deliver as a nation on that promise. And that was frustrating. But we've been working very closely with a bunch of different organisations, and now as soon as lockdown kind of comes down again and we start to receive refugee children, we've got a way that people can start the process to become what we're calling a supported lodger. So you provide somewhere to live in a family environment, normally for a 16 to 17-year-old lad, and most of them are lads. And they're coming not so much from Syria anymore. They're going elsewhere, but places like South Sudan, Eritrea, Afghanistan, and Iran and Iraq. That's where we're seeing a lot of kids coming from at the moment. And there's still a way we can kind of come good on that promise. We'd love to hear from some of your listeners if they'd like to be involved in that.
Yeah, brilliant. I was going to ask how we're getting on, because I didn't understand that we'd got anywhere near that number, but
we didn't. Yeah, we didn't, and then never mind. It's
still work to be done there.
Not to be angry, but there is still work to be done, and it does help when people like things and share things on Twitter and Facebook. But what's helped us with government is to say, look, we've actually got people that are willing to open their homes, welcome these kids. And that's politically powerful, because we're not just coming wagging a finger saying you've got a problem. We're saying you have got a problem, but we've got a solution. Help us to help you. Civic society, the church, the wider general public, we can do something amazing. And I think my prayer is that after lockdown, there might be a lingering new mindset that's there in the nation. Before lockdown, who did kids want to be when they grew up? They wanted to be Cristiano Ronaldo, didn't they? Or they wanted to be, I don't know, Blake Lively or someone, film stars and football heroes. But now my kids are talking about doctors and hospital workers and social workers and, people that keep supermarkets open and people that keep their broadband running and the electricity. We're having a very different mindset. So my prayer would be that there would be more people willing to offer hospitality to vulnerable children once we come out of this thing, because boy, are we going to need it.
Yeah, isn't that fantastic? Yeah, I completely recognise that. I've made the same observation, and it's really quite. There's an exciting thing about it. It's not all doom and gloom. There's that what if culture, and it's there's something somewhat romantic about looking back to the way society coalesced, came together, supported one another during crises like the most commonly referred to pre-existing example of as being wartime, and you mentioned the way we took on refugees at that time, and I would love to see something really positive come out from this too. I mean, I know that. I mean, it's reported today, I think, that NSPCC are seeing 20% increase in calls regarding the child abuse taking place, and there's been a very clear recognised spike of domestic abuse, and there are, because of the fact we're in these we're stuck in our houses. A lot of these problems aren't disappearing. So what are you going to do about it? And there's the challenge. How are we positioned in this country in regard to the amount of people that are in a position and have been approved as potential adoptive parents or fosterers?
There is a need. There's still a need. So before lockdown, many commentators would say we were 8,000 foster placements short, and we've got thousands of kids waiting to be adopted. So the need is there. And because of the pressure cooker that lockdown has been, we're expecting lots of kids. I'm actually pleased, don't hear this wrong, I'm pleased that more people are reporting through the NSPCC, because most children that come into care are spotted when they are at school. It's a teacher that recognises a child isn't behaving the way they used to, or there are bruises or other signs of trauma. And because kids aren't being seen, we're expecting there to be a kind of tidal wave of child protection referrals when schools are back. And so I would say there is stuff that you can do, being a good neighbour, not spying on your neighbours, but just looking out for the needs of children. Sadly, there was a brutal murder of 2 children recently, and it's this unbelievable pressure that the lockdown is doing on already at-risk families. And there's ways that we can be good neighbours now, but you can actually start the process already, even in lockdown, to be approved to be a foster carer or an adoptive parent. And we'd love to help if we can. So I'm sure you can share details with your podcasters on the how to get in touch with Home for Good.
Yeah, 100%. And you mentioned being a supported lodger. Is that something as well you might be able to be a conduit for?
Yeah. So we're working in various places around the UK, and supported lodging is basically, so if you're a teenage boy, you don't necessarily want to be treated as a baby, as a child. You might have been living, on your own for a couple of years actually to get to the UK, or in a refugee camp. But you're still not ready to live on your own. I mean, when lockdown happened, every family I know brought all their kids home, whether they're at uni or some people that had just left uni, some people in their first jobs, they all came home, because we recognise that family is the best place to support people in a crisis. Now, refugee young people, they're in a crisis. They need the love and support of a family around them. So supported lodging is like a halfway house between being a foster child and being an independent lodger. They come and live with you, and we wrap around them, we give them the support they need, but we're trying to help them get to a level of independence and adulthood.
One question I had was what you think the barriers are to why people don't think of adopting. You said it's often thought of as like a last option, if we can't conceive, and if we're not successful IVF or whatever, maybe we'll consider doing this. Like what is it? A stigma? What are the social barriers? Is it a financial thing, or what do we need to do to unblock that it becomes a more accessed option?
It's good. I think there is some stigma. I think it's just not on people's radar. Why would I think of adopting if I've already got kids of my own? It is just seen to be the third worst way to have a child. The other challenge is that the kids that are waiting to be adopted, that most of them are not babies. And most people coming forward for adoption really want a baby. Lots of the kids that are waiting are older. They might be in a sibling group. They might be, 2, 3, 4 plus up. Often they have special needs. Often they're from black and minority ethnic backgrounds. So there's a whole bunch of stigma issues around. And we're saying, look, you could be the parent that these children are longing for. And some people rule themselves out. They say, well, I couldn't adopt because I'm single. Well, actually, I'd rather a child had one brilliant parent in their lives than no parents in their lives. And single parents can do an amazing job at raising kids. So, actually, you could be an adopter as a single. You might be a bit older. You might think you're too old to do it. Actually, there's no upper age limit anymore. As long as you're relatively fit and healthy, we all have to have a medical. It would be bad if a child came into your care and then you weren't well enough to actually look after them. So, you could do that. Some people say, I've suffered with depression. I'm saying, well, actually, that could be a real gift, actually. If you're someone that's managing it and getting the help that you need, you'll be able to help a child. You'll be able to relate to a child that's dealing with trauma and mental health issues in their lives as well. So I'd say to people, don't rule yourself out. You could be an amazing parent. It will be hard work. Don't think about this like a romantic movie like Annie, where everyone goes off singing into the sunset. This is going to be tough, but it is also the most rewarding thing you can imagine. To be able to give a child the safety and security and love and care that they need is just a lovely thing to do, and it is incredibly rewarding.
Brilliant. Thank you, Krish. I'm going to give you one last question. We'll squeeze it in, and I'll put all the bits on the way out about your organisation, how people can get involved. All right, so leave that with me. But in closing, I want to ask you, which I ask everybody, what is your hope? What are you hopeful about the future?
So I'm hopeful this experience that we've had of lockdown will permanently change the way of what we prioritize in life. That we've realized just how much we need other people, that living alone isn't what we were designed to do. No one is an island, as John Donne famously said. We all need each other, right? And if you've had that experience, then imagine what it's like to be a vulnerable child with no sense of ongoing security in your life, and no one that's out there for you, no one as a backstop. There are kids in our country that are living in caravan parks and on canal barges and are being visited by social workers, and that is not appropriate for anybody, let alone a child that's had a really tough start in life. So my hope is that this terrible, awful thing that is the coronavirus will do something really beautiful and powerful to help us to reboot, reset, reimagine what life needs to look like. And I'm really hopeful and excited about what that could mean for the vulnerable children here in the UK, but the vulnerable children around the world too.
Krish, thanks so much for giving me your time today. I know you're a super busy man. I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on talking to us.
Pleasure. Yeah. Look forward to having a coffee with you sometime.
Oh, can you imagine? He's good, isn't he? I can see why they have him on the Zoe Ball Breakfast Show. What a great communicator and what a lovely bloke. So what do you think? Are you up for it? He makes a compelling case, doesn't he? It definitely planted a seed for me when I heard him speak a few months ago at the Justice Conference. I don't imagine I would make the best foster carer, or adoptive parent at this stage of my life. I mean, I change my job and address nearly as often as I change my bedsheets, but I really endorse what Krish has been sharing about how this is a great way of doing justice every day. I don't like the thought of children in this country and overseas being passed around temporary care facilities or institutions, vulnerable to exploitation and statistically more likely to suffer abuse or end up in prison or working in the sex industry, when what they need is somewhere to call home and a permanent person in their life to love them, to stick up for them. We all need that person, don't we? This whole coronavirus pandemic has in many ways brought out the best in our society, a more altruistic, loving community who are going to the shops for their elderly neighbours and standing on the doorsteps of their homes every Thursday to clap for those working in hospitals and care homes looking after us. We've probably never felt such a united kingdom since the war. So in that spirit of togetherness, how about looking into the opportunity to be a foster carer or even an adoptive parent for children who are in need of exactly that? I think a number of us that listen to that could think about responding to this issue. And if you do, how about you drop Krish and his team a line? The website to go to is homeforgood.org.uk. I want to close by reiterating what Krish said when he acknowledged that this is taking it to another level. But sending food and clothing parcels to refugee camps is still a good thing. Having a direct debit to charities you care for and support is still a good thing, and they do count. I wouldn't want anybody to be paralysed from doing good because they think it won't make any major difference in the whole scheme of things. No, every small action is contributing to a bigger response. So I don't want anybody to feel that their response isn't worth it. It most definitely is. But for some of us, you may be able to do something as incredible as give someone a home for good. This podcast was produced by Blue Bear Coffee Co. You can find out more about us at our website bluebearcoffee.com and follow us on all the usual social media channels. Thank you for listening this week. Speak soon. Peace.